Hello, this is Sylvia Fine, President of NAWMBA Seattle. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Inclusive Leadership in Action, with Venus Rekow, CEO of NeuroShifts. Today's webinar, Venus will show you how to master leadership. Say no more, please join me and welcome Venus.
Welcome to Inclusive Leadership in Action. My name is Venus Rekow, CEO of NeuroShifts. Thank you for the opportunity. We're super excited to support NAWMBA members. First, let me start by introducing you to my company. NeuroShifts is a consulting firm specialized in helping organizations create diverse, inclusive, and equitable work cultures. Our expertise lies in applying behavioral science to drive high levels of inclusion and develop sustainable, equitable practice. What this really means is that we understand that the journey of diversity and inclusion requires behavior change. And what we do is we support that behavior change through systems change and through individual change. Now, some of our services, we provide assessments, 360-degree assessments for the organization to understand how are their equity practices internally and externally, and also to learn from the ecosystem in which they operate. Second, we design learning initiatives that help raise competency levels about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Third, we conduct train-the-trainer sessions to drive dialogue across interracial relations. These will enable your diversity and inclusion volunteer team to upskill. And lastly, what you don't measure, you probably won't get done. So we help you measure your progress through analytics. What makes us different is that we combine a multidisciplinary approach to driving this work. One, we acknowledge that every person is in a human development stage, and that everyone has their own way of getting to their growth, their personal growth. And so we acknowledge that. We think about the systems in which people are embedded, what systemic barriers they may face. We also acknowledge that their brains specifically function in a manner that is according to biology. And then we design an environment that acknowledges that the decisions that we make are not only driven by our motivational drivers, but also by our environment, applying behavioral economic principles to the approaches that we have. Here are some of the examples of what people say about our sessions. Where do you start your journey? It's all up to you. We recommend that you start by really understanding where you're at as an organization in terms of practices and competency levels of knowledge. Use that data to create the strategy, the vision, the goals, and help leadership drive the work of diversity and inclusion. Then we support you by creating diversity and inclusion programs that may include training or specific redesigns of maybe your hiring systems. And lastly, measurement. We need to understand that what we do in shifting behavior has an impact so you can make progress. Whatever you are in your journey, reach out to us. Now, we're going to talk about inclusive leadership. And let me tell you what I hope that you get out of this session. One, do you understand the role that you play in fostering inclusion? Two, did you get grounded on inclusion research? And three, did you get new habits that drive inclusion? So, to begin, let's start by defining what inclusion is. Inclusion is a psychological experience that people have, feeling that they are heard and valued and respected both as individuals and as members of multiple identity groups. Social exclusion, which are acts that happen all the time in work settings and outside work settings, where maybe we don't get invited to meetings or we're not included in an email chain different ways that we may get excluded within the workplace actually impact our feelings of inclusion. And specifically, Naomi Eisenberg had done some research on social exclusion. And what she found is that the brain systems, the networks that are activated when you manage pain, physical pain, are also activated when you are feeling excluded. And this is because the way the brain works is two distributed networks. So it uses the same system to process different functions. Now, one of the things that we know about the social exclusion is that when it is consecutive, it's accumulative, it really impacts how do you feel about the environment in which you are embedded. And more importantly, it impacts your mental health and it impacts your performance. So as an inclusive leader, we hope that you understand the impact that you may have when you engage in social exclusion with your employees. And more importantly, that you choose to include, because including is a choice. It has to be an active choice because your brain automatically does not think about including. So let's start by defining what is an inclusive leader. It's a person that exerts influence through his, her, or their ability to include others, make unbiased decisions, communicate with transparency, and ensure everyone has access to participate in the social system. Every organization is a social system. And we know that people of color experience systemic barriers to fully participate in the social system, to be able to progress within the organization. All this happens because of the decisions that people make. So it's very important that you are aware of the responsibility you have to circumvent bias within your decision-making processes. The inclusive leader has two aspects. I think about the I and the we. The I is who do you need to become to be an inclusive leader? And the we is what do you need to do to engage in inclusive behaviors to manage the relationships with those that you work with. So let's start with the we, with the I. First, you need to understand what is your why. Why do you want to be an inclusive leader? Why did this matter to you? Is it because you think that that will make you a better leader? Is it because you have a very strong social justice compass and believe that being fair and equitable throughout your work, it's important to you? That's something that you need to start with. Then you got to figure out what's the what. What do you need to develop in terms of development and skill that enable you to be more inclusive? And how do you do these on a day-to-day basis? How do you do that at work? So let me start with the what. What are the skills that you need to develop to be an inclusive leader? Here is a pie that shows different skills. First, growth mindset. Being able to be open to influence, to be curious, to approach life as a learner, not as someone who knows everything, will enable you to share power with others because you will approach situations in a way that you will come to learn from others. Humility. Humility goes hand in hand when you acknowledge that you don't know everything, because in this knowledge-based era, it will be impossible for you to know everything. So acknowledging your limitations is quite important as an inclusive leader. Emotional intelligence. Being able to relate to others, understand how others experience the world differently from you. It's fundamental. And one of the things that inclusive leaders do is they're also think about the decisions that they make. Are those decisions unbiased? Are those decisions fair and equitable? Then they think about how can they develop an inclusive and transparent communication style where they don't need to be hiding things in order to accomplish their work. Risk takers. Inclusive leaders take risk. They are actually people who stand up against the grain. Maybe everybody else believes that it's okay to be disrespectful in a meeting. An inclusive leader will stand up and say that it is not okay, and will set the tone for what are the social norms, the behaviors that are inclusive within their team. Socially responsible is someone who really understands that the work that they do is attached to an impact to the community in which they operate. So they are always thinking about, from a moral perspective, what's the right thing to do that will benefit our communities? Because they know that the community has a weapon. And as Carla Harris has mentioned, the weapon is social media. And they can actually bring you back to justice if you don't apply your moral code. And with all of these different elements of the leader, they're able to drive collaboration across different teams, not within their only team, but across the organization, because they build what we call psychological safety. And I'll explain more about that. So if you're thinking, okay, where do I start? Let's start with emotional intelligence. It's important to have high levels of self-awareness. And when we don't take the time to study, to understand the experiences that people of color have, and understand how they may show up and how we show up, it's very easy to perpetuate the old beliefs that might be biased or racist. So it's very important to have high level of awareness to shift how we show up. Also, to exercise empathy when we communicate, because just as we don't know everything, nobody else does. And so being empathetic and really applying compassion to the relationships that we're driving within our team. Vulnerability. It's an aspect that requires you to share your limitations, to show that you're human. It's that simple. One of the things that I find really interesting and very simple to really enact is that in this bias production society, we forget to actively listening. And through the act of listening is when we enable others to feel included, when we enable others to feel seen. Second, growth mindset. When you adopt a growth mindset as a leader, you are a person who approach life with curiosity, who think about challenges from the perspective of learning. What can you learn from this situation? As painful as it is, maybe the project will be all a success. You're able to approach this and say, well, despite that, what can we learn? The other thing that you do is that you hopefully are able to be influenced by those who think differently than you. So you're not just hanging out with people who agree with you, but you're actually seeking to be challenged by others. And specifically, be influenced by people who belong to marginalized groups who don't normally get access to leaders and the ability to influence their thinking. 3, humility. Within organizations, one of the things that I find really fascinating is how power dynamics influences feelings of inclusion. People become very task-oriented, trying to drive their own agenda. And within that, driving their own agenda, they mold through people. They actually exclude them from information, from resources, and they don't really share their power. They don't think about how to enable others to succeed. I believe that being humble and acknowledging what you don't know is sharing power. Because when I allow the other person to really contribute to my life, I'm sharing that power that I may have, that I may be given because of my position. So humility comes with sharing power and with admitting mistakes and my own limitations. An inclusive leader is someone who not just relies on the people who they work with to better understand their identities, but they seek knowledge. They seek to learn and understand what people of color experience. Maybe people who identify from the LGBTQ community. What's that experience like? What does it mean to transition from one gender to another? Those are things that these inclusive leaders seek to understand. Maybe takes classes, reads, so they can interact and honor these individuals and allow them to feel seen and heard. Fifth, inclusive leaders are architects of decisions. They know that decisions have bias because they're made by people and we are biased. So they look for ways to circumvent the biases within those processes. And I'll talk more about how this happens. If you want to learn more about this, I recommend that you read Francesca Gino and John Bichar's article at Harvard Business Review called Leaders as Decision Architects. 6, conflict management. Leaders who are inclusive more likely have highly diverse teams. And with this diversity of opinion and thinking, it sometimes lead to conflict. So what inclusive leaders do well is they actually manage conflict effectively. 7, they focus on their communication style. They know that a lot of leadership behaviors happen through communication. So they think about what language is inclusive when they communicate with their constituents. They also think about the importance of transparency as a core value. They understand that good intentions may lead to bad impact. And if they do, they acknowledge the bad impact and try to repair the relationship. They advocate. They support people from minority groups to ensure that they have access to opportunities by mentoring or sponsoring them within their work groups. Another thing that they do is that they give credit to others. An inclusive leader is not about taking credit and recognition. It's about developing others and helping others thrive. Now, the we of the relationship. How do we act as inclusive leaders? First, we focus on developing what we call psychological safety. And psychological safety is the belief that your team member may have that he or she or they won't be punished or humiliated for speaking up. One of the ways this happens many times is when someone speaks up in a meeting and they may not be invited again to the meeting. That's one of the ways that people get punished for speaking up. So everyone else in the team takes notice. And what they do is the next time they may have a contrary idea, they just won't speak up. So Amy Edmondson, who coined the term psychological safety, mentions several things that we can do to drive this feeling of psychological safety. One of them is frame the work. She talks about the importance of setting the expectations for learning, not just performance. So people feel safe to learn and fail, because a lot of the work that people are trying to accomplish now requires failure. And I know that a lot of leaders sometimes talk about that, but the reality is they don't tolerate failure, they punish failure. And what I say to leaders many times is not what you say, it's really what you do. And how do you model the behavior? Humility. These leaders may share how they have made mistakes in the past and what their limitations are. Maybe they're going to say, hey, we're going to run this big project. And the reality is that I don't know everything. And we could fail. But let's try to figure out what's the best way to approach this project. To drive psychological safety, they have to embrace differences and acknowledge that people bring different perspectives, that there is going to be contrarian perspectives that may not feel good, because the truth is that when people disagree with us, it doesn't necessarily feel good. So they acknowledge the discomfort. Discomfort has to be part of the process. And I think the most important thing that an inclusive leader does is that they don't shame people publicly for mistakes. I recently heard from a friend of mine who said that she was shamed from a mistake by getting an email from her boss in which 30 other people were CC in that email, in which she used a very strong language to criticize her work. She really felt awful because she knew that she had made a couple of mistakes, but she didn't feel it was necessary for everyone to be part of it. And obviously someone reached out to her and saying, sorry, are you okay? And so those are some of the things that we, whether we're leaders or members of an organization, can do to really help others, because psychological safety is really driven by everyone, not just by the leaders. So how do you do these? Whether you're a manager or a leader, how do you drive inclusion within your teams? One, start with decision making. Empower others. Specifically, relinquish control when appropriate to benefit the greater good. Sometimes managers engage in so much control of the activities, of things need to be perfect the way they want it, that they don't allow people to think. They don't really share their power. People feel that they're hired just as a diversity quota, but no, because they're there to bring their value. Now, invite diverse groups to influence the decisions that you make, and employ fair and consistent criteria to make those decisions. Second, communication. Foster dialogue across your team. Create opportunities for people to respectfully disagree. Model disagreement. Invite people to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion in your team. Use inclusive language. Start modeling by sharing your pronouns so people feel safe to speak up and use their pronouns. Coach employees. There is a big difference between consulting or advising and coaching. Most people think they're coaching employees when they're telling them what to do, but in reality, they're really just advising them. Coaching requires that you ask questions and allow the person to think so they can figure out their own problems. Stop solving all the problems. Enable them to solve the problems. Model vulnerability. Be transparent about failures and wins. And have the courage to conduct difficult conversations with candor. 3, take the responsibility for driving a culture of inclusion. Think about diversity representation. Who is at the table and who's not? How do you ensure that you open the gates for people to be part of your team who are from different backgrounds? Ensure that employees can speak up. Remove any punishment that might be happening when people speak up. Respect for one another. This is something that you have to stress when you have a diverse team. The people need to acknowledge that the opinions can be different, but people need to respect that those opinions are different. And lastly, access. Create opportunities for everyone to grow and participate. We know that due to systemic barriers, cultural, some people of color may not have the opportunities to advance within your organization. So besides opening the door for them to participate or be part of your organization, find ways also to sponsor, to support them. Now, you can say, how do I do these every single day? You know, I have conversations with my colleagues, I have conversations with my employees, but I don't really know how do I enact this inclusion. Well, let me share with you 5 different habits that you could use to drive inclusion. 1, embrace diversity. Seek to influence your perspective by listening to people from different ethnic, gender, age, ability, or points of view. 2, share access. Remove barriers for others by sharing access to people in power or resources. It's very easy to think about, hey, who needs access to people in power? And how can I provide the access? Maybe it's through a sponsorship. Maybe it's through mentorship. This is my favorite value. My favorite habit, include and value. People assume that everyone wants to be included the same way. So they might get invited to the party. Maybe they do get asked to dance. But the reality is that we don't just come to dance at a party. We come to connect with people and we want to be heard. So start by asking people what make you feel included and valued. Determine the motivational drivers that people have to meet their individual needs. When you do that, you might find out how people want to be recognized, because we know that one of the reasons that people leave organizations normally is because they don't feel value for what they bring. They don't feel recognized. They don't get the credit. Now, when you recognize others, find out whether or not they want to be recognized publicly or in person. Don't assume that people want the same thing. And if you do provide recognition, be specific. Just saying you did a good job is not really recognition. That's a compliment. Being specific means that you can say, hey, Venus, you did a great job at that last meeting. I really appreciated how you created all that research and those insights that enable us to reach a different decision, which led to a better outcome. Lastly, speak up. Take a stand and support others. Ask people, how and when may I support you? Don't assume that you need to be the spokesperson. Think about how they might be wanting to be supported. And specifically, maybe they show up to the meeting and they have a great idea, but they know that nobody else is going to hear them because that's the way the dynamics run. So ask them, hey, would you like me to support you in that new idea that you have? Do you want to bring that up? How can I support you? Don't assume that you know how. Really ask them. Now, I want you to think about which of these inclusive habits you can start practicing now to drive inclusion within your teams, because it's everybody's responsibility, whether you're a manager or an employee. If you are an inclusive leader, one of the things that you are always thinking about when you're making decisions is trying to use a diversity and inclusion lens. And what this means is that when you show up to a meeting, when you're making a decision, you're always thinking about who is at the table and who is not at the table. What are the barriers that people who are not at the table facing? How can you remove those barriers so they can be part of that conversation? Maybe it is through giving people the information that they need. Maybe it's through allowing them to have access to decision makers. Now, the other thing that you do is you frame. You think about how the decision is framed, because we know that decisions have two parts of it. One is the biases that naturally your brain are going to fall into, and two is the motivational drivers that individuals have to make that decision. So let me give you a very simple example. We all know that making decisions, specifically the decision to be healthy, yes, it's an important decision. And so someone may say, hey, I want to lose 5 pounds. And that's the way their motivational driver is laid out. Somebody else may say, I want to be healthy. And that's just a different motivational driver. So how do you frame that decision matters, because that would engage or disengage someone in being part of the decision. Think about what can people win versus they lose. When we think about losing something, our brain naturally tries to avoid losses. So the last thing we want to do is lose. Now, not all biases are the same. And I think that the best example I have for that is just the gender bias. We had seen that we had made progress with the LGBTQ bias, where we actually have rights that are important and honored for people from the LGBTQ community, but we still struggle with gender equity. People seem to have difficulty seeing women as being able to be leaders. So not all biases are the same, and all biases apply to the same decisions. So you got to think about within your hiring decisions, within the promotion decisions, within your product development decisions, what biases are impacting those decisions and how you can circumvent them. Within teams, one of the way that biases get into the system is really through the processes of the status quo. Yes, it's everybody start agreeing, everybody saying yes to the decision without really thinking about it or having all the information or having to go through the discomfort of saying, no, you're wrong. And so if you are a leader, if you don't have a process that enables people to disagree or that rewards them for disagreement, then you're going to have a team that always says yes to everything. So breaking that status quo bias is quite important. With that, when you enable that process to break that, you may, for instance, create an anonymous voting process where people can share what they think without influencing others and without feeling punished for stating what they think. And the last part, in your decisions, because even when you make decisions that might be fair or equitable to some, may not be equitable to others. So you have to explain the impact that you have and communicate it to employees and say, hey, here are the pros, the cons, and this is the way I was thinking about it when I made this decision. Acknowledge that maybe it may not have the impact that you have anticipated. This is what an inclusive leader will do. In summary, if you are ready to be an inclusive leader, there are different areas that you can impact. It could be in your development, what you need to do to become an inclusive leader, or in the how you interact with others to drive inclusion. So let me share the last actions. 1, remove barriers for participating in decision making and circumvent biases by redesigning organizational processes. Think about the way you hire, think about the way you promote, think about how you develop your products, what biases might be there, what policies might be on the way, maybe how do you, for instance, assigned pay bands to people. Second, courage, dry dialogue about diversity and inclusion topics with employees. These topics sometimes feel very uncomfortable. So it's important that you be courageous and model by driving this dialogue with a lot of care and really compassion and intentionality. Take responsibility for your role in fostering inclusion and adopt one of the 5 inclusive habits. Sure, it will be great if you can adopt it all, but the reality is you need to start somewhere. Serve as mentors and sponsors, focus on underrepresented populations, and be humble about your achievements and your failures. And this culture in which self-promoting and lack of humility is what leads people to get promoted, I know it's really it's going against the majority to be humble. But I believe that it pays off at the end. Thank you very much. And I hope that you can connect with us. You can reach us on social media. You can find me on Twitter at Curious Venus, or Instagram at Neural Shifts, or send me an email. Thank you.